Mark Jennings had never considered himself a troublemaker. On the contrary, he was known as the quiet man on Oak Ridge Lane, the one who kept to himself with his peculiar but harmless hobbies. A custom-built gun shed tucked neatly behind his house and two towering guard llamas, Titan and Hercules, who paced the fenced yard like sentinels from another world. His neighbors were used to the oddity. The llamas were oddly endearing, and the shed, meticulously maintained, was a point of pride for Mark. But everything changed on a brisk Tuesday morning when an envelope, stamped with the HOA seal, slid silently under his front door. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled it free. The paper inside was crisp, but carried words heavier than their weight, a formal complaint from the HOA. The letter accused Mark's gun shed of being an imminent threat to community safety, demanding its immediate removal or face escalating penalties. The tone was cold, devoid of explanation or warning, as if the shed was some ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Mark's heart raced. He reread the letter, hoping the words would somehow change, but the message remained the same. His shed, his sanctuary, was suddenly an enemy to the very neighborhood he had chosen as home. Questions flooded his mind. Was this a mistake, a cruel prank, or something darker? His gaze drifted toward the yard, where Titan and Hercules stood motionless, their large, expressive eyes seeming to share his unease. The llama's ears flicked toward the sound of distant voices, the neighborhood stirring to life, the gentle hum of morning routines. But for Mark, the peace was broken. He stepped outside, crumpling the letter in his fist, and surveyed the quiet street. Oak Ridge Lane was still waking up, the houses lined in neat rows, their windows glinting in the early sun. Yet beneath this calm, a ripple of tension had begun, one that Mark hadn't anticipated. Across the street, Gloria Matthews, the HOA president, emerged from her house. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed and unnervingly composed. Mark had heard rumors about her ruthless dedication to community standards, but he'd never seen her in action until now. Gloria's eyes locked onto Mark's, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. Mark's stomach tightened. Was this personal? "Good morning, Mark," she called out, voice smooth, but edged with something colder beneath. "I'm sure you received our letter. We expect full compliance by the end of the week." Mark nodded cautiously, already sensing this was only the beginning of a war he hadn't asked for. As Gloria walked away, Mark turned to his llamas, their heavy breaths misting in the cool air. Titan's low hum vibrated through the yard, a warning, a promise. Mark clenched his jaw. Whatever the HOA wanted, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Because Mark Jennings didn't just own a gun shed, he owned two protectors. And the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge Lane was about to become very, very dangerous. The morning after the letter arrived, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cold coffee he hadn't touched. His mind churned with the implications. The HOA's accusation wasn't just an annoyance. It felt like a declaration of war. He glanced toward the window where Titan and Hercules grazed quietly in the yard. Their calmness was a stark contrast to the turmoil roiling inside him. What had he done to deserve this? His shed was legal, built within all zoning laws, and carefully secured. No one had ever complained before. Mark's phone buzzed, a text from Gloria. "Meeting tonight at the community center. Your presence is requested." Mark's heart sank. He knew these meetings rarely ended in fairness. That evening, the community center was crowded with neighbors, the air thick with whispered speculation and thinly veiled glances. Mark stepped into the room, feeling every eye on him, some curious, some judgmental, others downright hostile. At the front, Gloria stood like a general on a battlefield, her sharp gaze surveying the room. As Mark took a seat near the back, she began her speech. "Neighbors," she started smoothly, "we have a serious issue at hand. Mr. Jennings' gun shed poses a safety hazard. Many of you have expressed concern about the risk of accidents or theft. This is about protecting our community's peace and security." Mark's blood boiled. "That's not true," he whispered to himself, gripping the edge of his chair. Gloria's eyes flicked toward him briefly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her expression. One by one, neighbors spoke. Some voiced genuine concern, others echoed Gloria's line without question. Mark realized something chilling. The HOA was shaping the narrative, and the community was starting to buy it. Between speakers, Mark noticed a few faces exchange uneasy looks. A handful of neighbors avoided his gaze altogether. It was clear the HOA's influence ran deep, and challenging it would mean standing alone. After the meeting, Gloria approached Mark with a practiced smile. "We want to avoid legal action," she said. "Remove the shed voluntarily, and all penalties will cease. Otherwise," her words trailed off, but the threat hung heavy in the air. Mark's resolve hardened. He refused to be bullied into giving up what was rightfully his. But the unease lingered. Was Gloria's crusade just about the shed, or was there something beneath the surface? In the days that followed, strange things began happening. Mark noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his home, their occupants watching him with too much interest. His phone calls went unanswered. Neighbors who once greeted him now crossed the street. The guard Llamas grew restless, their instincts alert to unseen dangers. One evening, while checking the perimeter, Mark caught a shadow moving beyond his fence. He called out, but only silence answered. Titan let out a low hum, ears pinned back, signaling unease. Mark realized he was no longer just defending a shed. He was caught in a web of control, intimidation, and secrets that ran deeper than he ever imagined. And with every passing day, the shadows around Oak Ridge Lane grew darker. The sun was barely up when Mark spotted the unfamiliar black SUVs parked silently at the end of Oak Ridge Lane. His heart quickened, not from fear, but from the uneasy sense that something was about to tip over. Within minutes, 3 men in crisp, dark uniforms stepped onto his property, clipboard in hand, cameras at the ready. They introduced themselves as HOA inspectors tasked with safety evaluation. Their tone was polite, but laced with an edge that suggested this was no ordinary visit. Mark stood on his porch, watching closely as they circled the gun shed, measuring and photographing every inch. The Llamas, Titan, and Hercules paced nearby, their eyes never leaving the strangers. The creature's low hums and sudden stiffening caused Mark's skin to crawl. As the inspectors examined the shed's lock, one of them, a tall man with a hawkish gaze, suddenly pulled out a device Mark didn't recognize. It beeped faintly as he waved it over the walls of the shed. Mark's instinct screamed that something was wrong. "What's that?" Mark asked, stepping forward. The man smiled thinly. "Just a routine scan for safety compliance." But the device's persistent beeping and the way the inspector glanced nervously at his companions told a different story. They weren't there just to check a shed. They were searching for something hidden. Mark's gaze drifted to the other inspectors, who were now snapping photos of his llamas from angles that made him uneasy. Were they documenting the animals as some kind of threat? Or worse, evidence for a case they intended to build? Suddenly, one inspector stepped behind the shed, disappearing from view for several tense minutes. When he returned, his face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he held a small, sealed envelope. Mark's pulse raced. What had the inspector found? Before he could ask, the leader of the group cleared his throat and addressed Mark coldly. "We will be submitting a full report to the HOA board. Until then, we advise you not to interfere with the inspection process." Mark nodded cautiously, but decided to stay close. As the inspectors packed up, a sudden rustling noise erupted from the llama's pen. Titan let out a deep, warning hum, the hairs on his neck bristling. Hercules stepped forward, positioning himself between Mark and the inspectors like a silent guardian. Mark's throat tightened. Something about these inspectors wasn't right. They weren't just evaluating, they were hunting. But for what? As the SUVs disappeared down the lane, Mark felt a cold certainty. The HOA's war had escalated beyond petty rules. Whatever they were after, it was bigger than a shed, and if they came back, his llamas and he would be ready. That night, Mark pored over the sealed envelope the inspector had dropped accidentally on the ground. Inside was a hastily scribbled note, property marked for covert seizure. remove before enforcement. The message was clear, chilling, and illegal. But from home? Mark's eyes flicked toward the window where Titan and Hercules lay, their eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. They weren't just pets. They were protectors. And Mark knew one thing for sure. The quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge Lane was no longer safe. The fight was only beginning. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA's battle against his shed was just a smokescreen for something much bigger. The sealed envelope and its cryptic warning gnawed at him, and he knew he had to dig deeper, no matter the risk. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Mark grabbed his flashlight and slipped quietly out the back door. Titan and Hercules stood but remained calm, as if sensing the urgency. Mark moved toward the community center, the very place where Gloria and the HOA held their secretive meetings. He knew the risks of snooping, but something told him that answers waited inside those walls. Peering through a cracked window, Mark caught sight of Gloria's voice ringing out, sharp and commanding. Around her, a handful of HOA board members sat in tense discussion, their faces shadowed and tight. "Once we clear Mark's property, the development deal can move forward," Gloria said. "The investors are growing impatient. This neighborhood is ripe for transformation, but his stubbornness is the last obstacle." Mark's stomach churned. This wasn't just about a shed. It was a calculated land grab. Gloria and her cronies planned to bulldoze the peaceful street and build luxury condos, displacing families and changing Oak Ridge Lane forever. He listened as a man in a tailored suit chimed in, his voice low but cold. "We've quietly been buying properties on adjacent blocks. Once Mark's gone, the rest will follow." A knot twisted in Mark's chest. His fight was no longer just personal. It was a battle for the soul of his neighborhood. As the meeting broke up, Mark ducked away into the shadows, nearly bumping into a figure lurking nearby. A man in a hooded jacket quickly slipped away, dropping a small envelope at Mark's feet. Mark picked it up, heart pounding. Inside was a single line scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Trust no one, even those you call neighbors." Fear tightened its grip. Was someone watching him? And if so, who could he trust? Returning home, Mark's guard Llamas greeted him with heavy hums and watchful eyes. He realized they were more than pets. They were his last line of defense. Days passed with Mark quietly documenting everything. Photos of suspicious cars parked near his home, whispered conversations in the park, neighbors who suddenly avoided eye contact. The community was fracturing, loyalties shifting under the weight of Gloria's influence. One afternoon, Mark's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old barn at midnight. I have proof you need." Curiosity battled caution in Mark's mind. The old barn was a good 20 minutes from Oak Ridge Lane, secluded and isolated. But Mark knew one thing. He couldn't face this alone. As night fell, he loaded his flashlight, secured the llamas in their pen, and headed into the darkness. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound amplified in the still night air. The truth was out there, but uncovering it could cost him everything. And Mark was ready to risk it all. The moon hung low and heavy over Oak Ridge Lane, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across Mark Jennings's yard. Inside his house, Mark sat hunched over his desk, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his tired face. Documents, photos, and notes cluttered every surface, evidence of a fight far bigger than a mere gun shed. The anonymous tip had led into the old barn on the outskirts of town, just as the message promised. There, hidden beneath dusty floorboards, Mark had uncovered a stack of documents detailing the HOA's collusion with developers, forged permits, and plans to seize several properties, including his. It was proof of illegal maneuvering, a weapon in the battle to protect his home. But the victory was fleeting. Now the HOA had announced a forced removal of the shed, raid scheduled for dawn. Gloria's message was clear: comply or face the consequences. Outside, the llamas, Titan and Hercules, paced nervously in their pen. Their large eyes flickered with unease, sensing the tension in the air. Mark ran a hand along Titan's thick neck, feeling the steady thrum of his protective hum. "Tomorrow," Mark whispered, "they're coming for us. He glanced out the window. Lights flickered in neighboring houses. Some windows dark, others lit with weary watchers who had begun to pick sides. Rumors spread like wildfire, neighbors whispering about what might happen next. The quiet suburb had become a powder keg. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the stillness, a faint scraping against the side fence. Mark froze. Titan and Hercules immediately turned their heads, ears twitching. Mark's pulse quickened as footsteps echoed softly outside. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch, peering into the darkness. Nothing. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A young woman, her face partially obscured by a hood. "Mark," she whispered urgently, "you need to know. Gloria's hired a private security firm. They'll be here first thing in the morning. They're not just enforcing rules. They're looking for something or someone." Mark's heart pounded. "Who are you?" "Someone who used to believe in this neighborhood," she said bitterly. "But I couldn't stand by and watch it die." Before Mark could respond, a sudden noise startled them both. A car door slammed down the street. The woman slipped away into the darkness as quickly as she'd come, leaving Mark with a new, chilling reality. Back inside, Mark locked every door and window, double-checked the Llamas' enclosure, and prepared for the worst. His mind raced through every possible scenario. Would the Llamas hold the line? Would the neighbors intervene or hide behind closed doors? And what if Gloria's forces were better armed than he expected? As the night deepened, Mark sat back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. But sleep refused him. Every creak, every whisper of wind, sent jolts of adrenaline through his veins. Outside, Titan and Hercules settled beside the shed, their massive forms silhouetted against the moonlight like ancient guardians. Mark realized something profound. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire Oak Ridge Lane. And when the first light of dawn broke, the battle for his home and his neighborhood would begin. Dawn arrived like a silent predator stalking Oak Ridge Lane. Mark woke before the sun, his body taut with adrenaline and anticipation. Outside, the sky was painted in pale shades of orange and pink, but there was no beauty in the morning. For Mark, the day was a battlefield. The street was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by a cold wind. Neighbors peered cautiously from behind curtains, their faces a mix of fear, curiosity, and divided loyalties. Mark knew some hoped for peace. Others were ready to watch him fall. Minutes before the HOA's enforcers arrived, Mark stood at his gate, flanked by Titan and Hercules, their massive bodies tense and watchful. The llama's low humming filled the air, a sound that seemed to pulse like the heartbeat of Oak Ridge itself. Then, down the street, the convoy appeared, black SUVs followed by a swarm of men in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind dark glasses and grim expressions. The private security firm Gloria had hired, just as the mysterious woman had warned. Mark's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary HOA dispute anymore. These men were armed, professional, and ready for conflict. Gloria stepped out of the lead vehicle, her posture regal, her lips curled into a triumphant smile. "Mr. Jennings," she called out, voice cold and commanding. "This is your final warning. Remove the shed peacefully, or we will proceed with enforcement." Mark's eyes flicked to the shed behind him. It stood strong, but he knew the real power was not in the wood and nails. It was in the two enormous llamas beside him. Without hesitation, the security team advanced. Suddenly, Titan let out a deep, resonant hum that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Hercules followed, their combined energy almost palpable. The llamas surged forward like living battering rams, powerful legs pounding the pavement. The security men scattered, caught off guard by the unexpected assault. Chaos erupted. Titan charged directly into the nearest SUV, knocking it off balance. Hercules herded the men down the street, his massive frame pushing back their advance. The street filled with shouts, scuffling, and the crackling of radios. In the confusion, the llamas herded the enforcers straight toward an arriving police cruiser, called by a neighbor who had finally picked up the phone. The cruiser screeched to a halt, and before the officers could react, Titan and Hercules corralled the security men toward the vehicle, trapping them against its steel frame. Mark's heart pounded as he watched the surreal scene unfold. His guard llamas had become an unstoppable force of nature, herding the invaders like frightened cattle. The officers quickly assessed the chaos, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Stand down," one shouted into his radio. Within moments, the raid was halted and the security men were detained. Mark approached the officers, breathless but defiant. "This shed is legal," he said, voice steady. "And these llamas protect more than just me. They protect this neighborhood." Gloria's triumphant smile faded into something colder, calculating, dangerous. But the damage was done. The day had turned. Oak Ridge Lane would never be the same. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over Oak Ridge Lane, but the tension refused to dissipate. The chaos of the morning had left the neighborhood shaken, its fragile peace shattered. Mark stood beside Titan and Hercules, the massive llamas now calm but alert, their eyes scanning the street. The police cruiser still sat idling, its officers speaking quietly with neighbors and taking statements. The detained security men were being questioned nearby. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare might be over. But Mark knew better. Gloria Matthews, the HOA president, retreated to her sleek black SUV, her face a mask of fury and calculation. Her power had been checked today, but not broken. Neighbors approached Mark cautiously, some offering quiet words of support, others still wary or openly hostile. The battle had revealed divisions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Among the crowd, a few familiar faces surprised Mark. Jennifer, the elderly widow who rarely spoke but always had sharp eyes, approached with a determined look. "I saw what your llamas did," she said softly. "Maybe it's time we stopped hiding behind rules written by people who don't care about us." Her words sparked murmurs of agreement. Slowly, neighbors began to form clusters, debating and whispering. Some pledged quiet support, others vowed to keep their distance, afraid of Gloria's influence. Mark realized the fight wasn't just his anymore. The neighborhood was awakening, fractured but awakening. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at Mark's door. He opened it to find the hooded woman from before, the one who'd warned him about the private security firm. "My name's Lisa," she said, lowering her hood. Her eyes were sharp, fierce. "I'm part of a small group pushing back against Gloria's plans. We've been watching the HOA's moves for months." Mark invited her inside. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing information and strategies. "We can't just defend your shed," Lisa said grimly. "We need to expose the entire scheme. Corruption, illegal deals, everything. But we have to be careful. Gloria has eyes everywhere." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. This was a battle for the neighborhood's future, for justice. But even as alliances formed, darker threats lurked unseen. That night, while Mark slept fitfully, a shadow slipped through the darkness toward his property. Titan and Hercules stood, their hums low and warning. A figure moved silently near the shed, placing something beneath the floorboards, a small, blinking device. Gloria's war wasn't over, and the real fight, the one Mark hadn't seen coming, was about to begin. The night hung heavy with tension. Mark lay awake, senses sharpened by the mounting threats that had infiltrated his life. The faint hum of Titan and Hercules outside was his only comfort, a steady rhythm against the creeping silence. But then the sudden beep, faint, electronic, echoed from beneath the gun shed. Mark's heart jolted. He raced outside, the llamas immediately alert, their ears swiveling toward the sound. Kneeling by the shed's foundation, Mark found a small, blinking device wedged under a loose board, a covered surveillance and tracking gadget. His blood ran cold. "Gloria's not just trying to push me out," he muttered. "She's spying on me." With careful hands, Mark dismantled the device, his mind racing. This invasion of privacy was a line crossed. Before he could think further, headlights flooded the yard. A convoy of unmarked vehicles pulled up, and the figures from earlier security raids re-emerged, this time with the backing of local law enforcement. But something was different. The officers in this group wore badges emblazoned with special investigations. Mark's blood ran cold with confusion and fear. Were these allies or enemies? Suddenly, Lisa appeared from the shadows, flanking Mark with a calm confidence. "They're here to help," she whispered. "There's been a bigger investigation all along. Corruption within the HOA and beyond. Gloria's empire is collapsing." The special investigators moved quickly, uncovering hidden evidence stored in Gloria's office and seizing documents that implicated her in fraud, bribery, and illegal land deals. Gloria was arrested on the spot, her reign of terror unraveling faster than anyone expected. Mark watched as justice finally took hold, but the cost was clear. The neighborhood had been scarred by mistrust, fear, and mere violence. In the days that followed, neighbors came together, inspired by Mark's courage and the Llamas' fierce protection. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a community council dedicated to transparency and fairness. And the gun shed. It remained untouched, a symbol of resistance and resilience. As Mark stood outside, Titan and Hercules at his side, he smiled softly. The Llamas had done more than defend a shed. They had defended a way of life. But the final twist? One morning, months later, Mark received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single line. "Not all battles are won where you expect." Mark looked down at his Llamas, then to the horizon. The fight for Oak Ridge Lane was over, but the war for freedom and trust was never truly done.